In this video, I want to tell you how I paint my miniatures step by step. Just to be upfront, I'm not a competitive professional painter. I paint for tabletop quality, meaning good enough where they look really good on the tabletop, but I'm not trying to win any competitions. I am a lot better and a lot faster at painting than I was when I first started, so that's kind of what I want to do here, share some of those lessons. And a lot of what I do are beginner-friendly techniques, like using washes and dry brushing. So that's a lot of what I'm going to be talking about. It's stuff that some professional painting channels might tell you to stay away from, but I think we kind of have different goals. I want really cool looking kill teams and skirmish game models, and I'm trying to paint a 2,000 point orc army. They're trying to win competitions and make one model look as good as humanly possible, so it's just different. So we'll get started with the supplies and the prep work you have to do before you paint. This isn't the actual hobby building the model, this is assuming you have a built model, so we're starting there. The first thing I do is buy a primer. There's a lot to choose from, and I used to use these paint-on primers, but I found that it left the model looking a little weird and blotchy, which it still worked, but it made some of the details hard to distinguish, and I just didn't like that method as well as what I do now. What I do now is I spray prime all of my minis. So there's two main reasons to prime your models. The first is that it lets the paint stick to the model better. So you'll find that when you're applying paint, especially if you're using thin layers or something not very bright, it will actually adhere better. And the other is I can control a base layer for some of my models. That doesn't always apply, but in some cases it can be really helpful. You can always use white or gray primer, but if your model is mostly one color, I go ahead and spray it that color. I like to use these paint and primer combos from either Krylon or Rust-Oleum. They're pretty cheap and you can find them at basically any hardware store or something like Hobby Lobby. I try to find ones that say they're for plastic and they're a matte finish. That means it's for the right material so you'll know it works, and the matte finish means it won't be shiny, so it will be easier to paint over. Obviously, there are miniature-specific spray primers like the Army Painter or Citadel. They're just kind of expensive for what they are, and I've never felt the need to use them. I never felt like my priming is my bottleneck. So for an example of what I was talking about earlier, where I said you can apply a base layer, here's a DACA jet I was painting, and I wanted to make it orange. So I used this spray primer, and it was hardly the color I wanted. All I really had to do was paint over the details. So if you don't have a primary color you're using, either go with white, gray, or black. And do it based on the shade of the model. Meaning if you're using a lighter model that has a lot of light, bright colors, go with white. If you're using a really dark model, like something that's a really dark red, go with a black primer, because it will give the entire model a darker tone. And if somewhere in the middle you can use gray, gray is pretty universal. So I always prime outside on a piece of cardboard, with either the model on the sprue or the model completely built. Do not cut it off the sprue and then spray prime it, because it is pressurized aerosol, and it will blow bits all over your yard. Trust me, learn from my mistakes on that. There are still pieces of granite somewhere in my yard I never found. So shake the can up well beforehand, and start it about a foot away from the model. Don't aim directly at whatever you're spray priming. Start it there and then sweep over whatever it is you're trying to prime. The reason you do that is if you aim it directly at the model and then start spraying, it might spray way too much onto there. You can't really control how much is coming out on that initial spray, and you don't want to get too much primer on there, because it would hide some of the details. So once your sprue or your model is dry to the touch, either bring it inside the house or inside the garage, and let it sit overnight to cure. I don't know if you really have to do this. I just always let it sit overnight, just to make sure it's fully dry before I start actually trying to paint it. So now let's talk about what you'll actually need to paint your miniature. The first and most obvious thing is your actual paint. You'll want watercolor acrylics, and I highly recommend buying actual model paint. It's going to be a lot more expensive than somewhere like Walmart or the dollar store per ounce, but it's purposely made thinner to apply thinly over your model so the details will show through. That's how you get those really clean looking models, and it's not like a thicker looking layer. Not that you can't use the Walmart paint and have it look good, it's just a lot easier with actual hobby paint. I normally don't like to spend money where I don't have to, but I wouldn't cheap out on that part. So there's a bunch of really good brands. What I personally use are either Vallejo, Citadel, or the Army Painter. I just haven't tried the other ones, so I can't speak to those, but I know all of those work well. So Citadel is Dames Workshop, so the actual 40K company's actual brand, and their paint works really well, but a disclaimer, their naming conventions are kinda weird. Like, I was really confused for a while at how their stuff works, so I just avoided it entirely. So I'm going to try to explain it to you really simply. First of all, you'll just have to Google what the colors are. I like to go on Google and type in that color and go to images, and you'll see actual other miniatures people have painted with that color. That gives you a lot better idea than just the little square on the paint rack, because you actually get to see what it looks like on a model. So what I use, if the model is mostly one color, I'll use a contrast paint from Citadel, or the equivalent for the Army Painter is a speed paint. What that means is that it's kind of an all-in-one paint. These paints you apply in a few thin layers, so you'll have to paint over your model a couple times, and they'll be pretty watery, so the thin layers is really easy. And what happens is as you paint, it automatically creates that shadowing effect. So the crevices will be darker and the high points will be lighter, just kind of automatically. It works pretty well. So from the D&D company, I painted this blue salad, or I always call it a blue salad, with speed paints. I did some other stuff to it, but you can kind of see with the blues what I'm talking about here. It's supposed to kind of be a one-step paint. It works pretty well. It's not perfect, but it gives you a really good base. And it's really fast, so if you're trying to paint a bunch of models really quickly, it's a pretty good way to do it. So if I just want a nice, well-covered area, I use a base from Citadel, or I'll use a paint from the Army Painter of Vallejo, just not one that says speed paint or wash or anything like that. These are just meant to cover the plastic or the primer and just give you a solid color. Like if I show you an orc I'm painting, mostly their shirt and their skin and their pants and their boots are all done with just a base color. Then if I have metallics, I like to get a metallic that fits it, whether it's a bronze or it's a silver, and then I use washes. So these are basically really watery paint that naturally will go in crevices and create a shadowing effect. So for what wash I mostly use the Army Painter, but for a black wash, known oil is really popular. That's kind of like the industry standard. So for something where it's a really dark color, I'll use dark tone from the Army Painter. But for like orc skin, I use green tone. And I just got some soft tone to use on more of like a khaki color. So you can really use the wash that fits whatever color you're using. And then for paints that aren't the primary color of the model you're using, I like to have some white, yellow, black, and brown laying around. The reason I like those colors is you can darken up or lighten your other colors you're using with those. So if you want more of a highlighted spot or you want somewhere that's a little darker, you can do that. So that's all the paints you really need to have. You can have some other fun stuff like different effect paints. Like I like to use fluorescent neon paints because I've always thought I really want like a blacklight arena to play in. So I paint a lot of my models with a little bit of fluorescent on them. That way if I ever get to do that, I'll actually have models that will glow and look cool. Now for other tools, we'll start with brushes. So for brushes, I started off with just the pack of the really cheap Walmart brushes. And they work fine, honestly. That's all you really need. Just the bad thing is they're fine points. They'll lose those points pretty fast. And then you have to replace them. So you'll constantly be replacing your brushes. And that can kind of be annoying. And in those cheap kits, I only ever use 1 or 2 brushes out of them most of the time. So the rest just kind of build up in a pile of cheap throwaway brushes. So now what I use are almost exclusively the like $5 to $10 range from somewhere like Hobby Lobby. So I use around 3 for almost everything. And then if I have a really small detail like a belt buckle or eyes or teeth, I use around 1. So I do like having some cheaper brushes around because there's sometimes like when you're using metallics, it can be really hard on your brush. So I just use cheap brushes for that. And then for dry brushes, I think I got this tip from Tabletop Minions. I just had my wife give me some of her old makeup brushes she doesn't want anymore, and they work really well. And I think you can get these for like $1 at the dollar store, or you can order them online for really cheap. So I've never used anything that's over a $10 brush, so maybe I'm missing out, but I feel like my skill is the bottleneck and not the tool I'm using. For other tools, you need a cup of water, preferably something that's not a cup you'll ever actually drink out of, unless you live by yourself and you just like the taste, no judgment. And then I have a plate and some paper towels, just so I don't get stuff everywhere. Once again, disposable plate and not one you'll actually use. I don't have a dedicated paint area. I normally do it at my work desk, so I just don't want to get paint everywhere, so I'm extra careful about laying out towels. And then I use a wet palette from the Army Painter. These are really nice to have. It helps keep your paint wet so it doesn't dry out as fast, and it helps thin the paint out just a little bit. A really nice thing with these is if you need to walk away for a while, you can put the lid on this and put it in your fridge, and it will actually keep the paint wet because there's like a moist environment in there. So that's awesome. You don't go through nearly as much paint if you're using this method. Then I absolutely love this paint handle from Citadel. It just makes holding the miniature more ergonomic. It's really comfortable to use. It just keeps your hand from cramping up if you're doing a really long paint session. It doesn't give you better results, it's just nice to have. And finally, and this is really important, have some good lights. I have this little bendy light that you can just point directly at whatever you're painting. I tend to steal lamps just from all over the house and bring them to wherever I'm painting, just so I can light it up and really see all the little details on the miniature. And it keeps you from having eye strain, so you won't end up getting a headache or anything like that if you're painting for a long time. And if you can make your lights daylight, that's pretty good too. A lot of lights just have that yellow tint, and it can kind of distort the actual colors you're seeing. Now that we have everything we need, let's talk about the actual process. I start by figuring out what colors I actually need. That way I can actually have my paints lined out. So I normally do this if it's a model I haven't painted before. I'll look for inspiration online, just to see what other people have done. I almost never actually copy straight out their color scheme, but it will let me see, oh, if this part is complementary to this, it looks good. Or if you have two way contrasting colors here, that will look good. So I'll leave that up on my computer as I paint, and then I get my wet palette ready and my water source. Besides that, I just set out all the paper towels and all the supplies I need, so I'm ready to go. Then I start out with the big main colors, using that round 3 brush. The reason I start with this instead of the fine detail is you will probably get sloppy when you're doing the main big colors, and you don't want that to go over on the details after you've already painted it. So I'd rather go fast on the big colors, and then be really slow on the details later. So anytime you're going to put paint on your wet palette, make sure to shake it up well. This just makes sure everything's mixed together well. And then I just put a little bit on the wet palette. So then I get my brush wet, and I did a little bit of paint on the tip of the brush, and then you want to kind of smooth it out. So if you see here, you just want it where when you run your brush along your palette, it leaves a nice smooth area. This just takes some practice, and some of it honestly depends on the individual paint you're using. Because if the paint's too thick, it's going to be gloppy on the model and high details. If it's too thin, you'll just have to use a bunch of coats and it won't cover very well. If it's something like a contrast paint, it's going to look thinner than this on your palette, and that's fine. It's designed to do that. With most colors, I end up doing roughly 2 layers. With speed paint, I'll do 3 to 5 typically. So once I finish one color, let's say it's an orc and I'm doing like khaki pants on him, and I finish using the tan, then what I do is I wash my brush out before going on to the next color. You just want to swirl it around in the water and kind of wipe it off on the edges. Just make sure not to push your actual brush to the bottom of the cup you're using. This will damage the bristles and just wear your brush out really fast. And then with the next color, you just repeat that process till you have all of your big main colors on your model. So your model should basically be the color scheme you want. It's just going to lack any detail and look kind of plain. Now let's go in and paint those details. Like here, I'm going to start with brown because I already have brown on my wet palette. So I'm going to do stuff like his belt and the leather straps he has. Here you can use a smaller brush like a round one or whatever you have. It just depends on the size of the details. And then once you have that, you want to do stuff like white on his teeth, or if you want to paint fingernails or buckles. So this is the same process overall as the big colors. You're just using a smaller brush and you're going more slowly. So once you have all those details painted on, this is when you go really slow and you use basically your smallest brush and you do cleanup detail. Because there will be areas where you realize two colors didn't totally come together and you see your primer color underneath of it. Or you'll see areas where you accidentally got one color on top of another. So just go back and clean up those details. I normally have a lot of these where I messed up, so it's not a big deal. Just take your time and cover everything up so it looks good. So this is where I like to try to give it some style. And I'll start with the metallics. So if there's any metal components that I want to give a little bit of a shine, I do that here. I just try not to go overboard, especially for orcs, because their stuff isn't shiny and new. So I just do a little bit of it, and just kind of even dab it on the metal components. It will just give it a little bit of a shine. And a reminder here, metallics can be rough on your brush, so try to use something cheaper. Here, I'm just going to do his big weapon, and I'm going to do a little bit on top of the gun, because that's where the light would be shining directly at. So I want to give it a little bit more of a shine. And I might do a little bit on the top of the grenade too, just to show that it's kind of catching and reflecting a little bit of that light. And now it's time to shade and use our washes. So like I said earlier, there's two ways to do this. One is using a wash, which is kind of the noob way to do it, but most of the time that's what I do. Or you can take your paint and add just either a touch of brown or a touch of black and darken it up a little. Like, you just want to use a microscopic touch of black. Or you can use something like a darker gray. And then you can kind of paint in where the shadows would be. It's kind of hard to do, but it does look really good, and it looks way more natural. I'm trying to build a big hammer orc list right now, so I have way too many miniatures to mess around with. So that's why I'm using washes right now. But I personally think washes look fine. But go with whatever you think looks good. So where I differ from a lot of people is some people just ground their model in a wash. It gives it kind of like a little bit of a shine, and it really will shadow out everything that needs shadowed. I just think it darkens up the model and makes it look a little murky, so I only use it in the parts that I want to darken up. I think about where shadows would naturally occur and use it there, or anywhere where there's like a bunch of crevices, because the light would catch that and create shadows. So this orc has giant arm muscles, so I use the green tone and go kind of in between those crevices, and it will just give it some more contrast, really make it show more and make them look even deeper. And then I'll use a little bit on his face just to make the details stand out a little more. You just want to make sure if you're using a colored wash like green, you don't get it on something that's not green or it won't look right. So another thing I do is when I switch over the dark tone, I actually use it on the dark shadowed areas like I talked about before. But I also use it on anything that's a brown leather material because it kind of gives it a shine, kind of like some leather has in real life. And then if I use the metallic color on a weapon and I want it to look a little grungy, I'll use a little bit over top of that too. So before we're done with our actual washes, another technique I use is I'll take the dark tone from the Army Painter and add some red to it. You'll have to play around with the ratio. And I think it gives it kind of either a blood or a rust effect. So I'll paint that on as well. So I'll take a cheap brush and just dab it over anything that I want that effect on. Now for our final step, we have highlighting. So like shadowing, there's two ways to do it. One is the professional method and the other is the kind of cheap way to do it. I like the cheap way, which is dry brushing. So the fancy like competition way to do it is you take a little bit of that yellow and that white, you mix it up with your paint, and you make a lighter version of what you're using, or you find a paint that's just naturally a lighter version of what you have. And then you just paint that on anywhere that there would be highlights, so anywhere the sun would be hitting. There's ways where you can blend this into your other colors. It's a little bit harder to do. I've done it on a couple models and got it to look good. But it's kind of hard to pull off. It takes a little bit of practice, but it's not too bad. So what I do is I do the same thing where I mix my colors up. But then I take one of those old makeup brushes I talked about earlier, you put a little bit on there, and then you basically just wipe off a ton of it on a paper towel. So you just have a little bit on there. And then you just kind of brush that over whatever areas that are high up, and it naturally kind of hits the high spots. And if there's any ridges sticking up, it will hit that, but it won't hit anything below it. Just the way the makeup brush kind of works. So it's nice that it kind of hits those raised, jagged edges. Like on the orc, it will hit the upper parts of his arm, the upper part of his bicep, stuff like that. So after you've done your highlighting, you'll have the washes that are darkening the darkest parts of the model. You have your base coat that will kind of show through. And then you have your dry brushing that will highlight the higher areas. So between that and doing a couple things like the rust effects, you can get a model that really has a lot of definition to it, and it just has more details and looks a lot more realistic than if you just did your base coats. It's just using some of those techniques will make the model look more dynamic and look like you're a lot better at painting than you actually are. So it's kind of an easy way to paint to make your model look decent. Well, at least I think they look decent. I'm pretty happy with them. Obviously, it just depends on your personal taste. So this is by far not the best way to paint. I'm sure there are plenty of painters out there that would absolutely roast my method and my results, and that's fine. I'm personally happy with where it is now, and over time I'm slowly adding in those other techniques, like actually painting in the highlights, trying to blend colors, edge highlighting, all the stuff that the more advanced painters are doing. But hopefully if you're new to painting, this gives you an idea of where you can start at and some basic techniques you can use to make your models look decent. The big thing that matters is paint your models in a way that you think looks really cool. Make them where you like them, because at the end of the day, that's what really matters. Thank you for watching.